In the summer of 1812, the earth trembled under the weight of 600,000 men. They lined the Russian border, a wall of steel and iron that stretched beyond the reach of the eye. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the front, his gaze fixed on the distant, unbroken horizon. He had humbled the empires of Europe. He had rewritten the maps of Italy, Prussia, and Austria. He had placed the crown upon his own head with his own hands. Yet, he stood on the precipice of the gravest error. The silence of the border was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy breathing of horses and the metallic clatter of equipment. Napoleon did not move. He watched the line of trees ahead, searching for a sign of resistance that did not exist. He raised his hand, and the march began. Years before the crown, there was only the cold stone of the military academy. Napoleon was a stranger in a land that did not want him. He spoke with a thick, jagged accent that drew laughter in the mess hall. When he walked through the corridors, heads turned, whispers followed, and doors closed. He was a minor noble with no influence, a target for those who measured worth by lineage. He did not fight back with words. He retreated. He sought the silence of the library, where the dead could not judge him. He spent his nights hunched over maps, tracing the movements of Caesar and Hannibal with a trembling finger. He learned how to trap an enemy in a valley, how to break a line with a single decisive charge, and how to hold ground when all seemed lost. He memorized the logistics of ancient campaigns until the ink blurred on the parchment. Every insult from his peers became fuel. He stopped listening to the taunts of the present and started living in the strategies of the past. He was waiting for the world to break. In 1789, the old world fractured. The streets of Paris roared with the sound of breaking glass and falling stone. The monarchy crumbled, and the rigid hierarchies that had kept a minor noble from Corsica in the shadows were swept away by the tide of the revolution. This was the opening he had calculated for in the dark corners of the library. Napoleon did not wait for an invitation. He moved into the chaos, his eyes fixed on the military ladder. His first true test arrived at the port of Toulon. The British fleet held the harbor, their cannons commanding the bay. The French forces were disorganized, their morale shattered. Napoleon arrived with a battery of artillery and a singular, cold focus. He ignored the panicked debates of his superiors. He studied the terrain, mapped the angles of the British defenses, and placed his guns on the heights overlooking the water. Under the cover of night, he opened fire. By dawn, the port was his. At 24, the outsider had become a commander. The victory at Toulon was only the beginning. In 1796, the Directory handed him command of the Army of Italy. It was a broken force. Men lacked boots, rations were non-existent, and the soldiers were more accustomed to retreat than victory. Napoleon did not reorganize them with speeches. He drove them into the mountains. He bypassed the slow, heavy baggage trains that burdened his enemies and moved his columns with a speed that defied the geography of the Alps. He hit the Austrian lines before they could consolidate their positions. At Lodi, he personally directed the placement of his cannons, standing in the path of fire to force his men across the bridge. The Austrian defense shattered under the weight of his relentless pressure. He moved from one valley to the next, trapping entire divisions in pincer movements. He stripped the Austrians of their territory. He was no longer just a commander of artillery. He was a force of nature. The political leaders in Paris began to watch him with awe and fear. Paris was a cauldron of corruption and indecision. The Directory had squandered the gains of the revolution, leaving the government paralyzed by internal bickering. Napoleon returned from the front to find a nation waiting for a hand to steady the wheel. He did not hesitate. In November 1799, he marched into the legislative chambers. The deputies shouted, the guards hesitated, and the fragile structure of the Republic collapsed under the weight of his presence. He dissolved the assembly and established the consulate, naming himself First Consul. He was no longer a servant of the state. He was its architect. He reorganized the legal code, stabilized the currency, and centralized the administration with the same precision he applied to his artillery. Yet, the title of consul felt like a temporary measure. He wanted permanence. In 1804, he invited the Pope to Notre Dame, but he did not wait for the blessing of the Church to define his status. As the ceremony reached its peak, he took the crown from the altar and placed it upon his own head. The revolutionary who had once fought to destroy kings had become the most powerful sovereign in Europe. He had transformed from a soldier of the Republic into the master of a new empire. By 1807, the map of Europe was a canvas for his ambition. Prussia had been dismantled. Austria was a vassal in all but name, and the borders of his influence stretched from the Atlantic to the Vistula. He had dismantled the old alliances and replaced them. Yet, one shadow remained. Across the English Channel, the British fleet held the seas, and their defiance acted as a constant drain on his resources. He could not reach them with infantry, and his attempts to challenge their naval supremacy had ended in disaster. Frustration mounted. He turned from the battlefield to the ledger, convinced that he could break the British spirit by starving their economy. He decreed the Continental System, a total blockade that forbade any port under his control from trading with the island nation. Instead, the plan turned into a slow-acting poison for his own empire. European ports fell silent, trade routes withered, and the merchants began to whisper of betrayal. The trap he set for his enemy was beginning to close around his own throat. The Continental System was failing, and the first to openly acknowledge the disaster was the Tsar. In 1810, the Russian ports reopened to British goods, effectively shattering the blockade. The news reached Paris like a direct challenge to his authority. Napoleon did not view this as a simple trade dispute. He saw it as an act of personal betrayal. He had spent years binding the nations of Europe to his will, and the thought of a sovereign power ignoring his decrees was intolerable. He began to plan for a reckoning. The decision was made in the quiet of his study, but the execution would shake the foundations of the continent. He began to pull resources from every corner of his empire. Orders were dispatched to every garrison, every supply depot, and every armory. 600,000 men were gathered. A force so massive it required a logistical effort that defied conventional military wisdom. The mobilization was absolute, a relentless gathering of steel and ambition that signaled the end of the peace. In June 1812, the border vanished under the weight of 600,000 boots. The Grande Armée surged forward, expecting a wall of steel to meet them. They found only empty horizon. The Russian forces did not stand. They melted away into the vast interior. As the French columns advanced, the land itself turned hostile. Villages were not just abandoned, they were reduced to charcoal. Granaries were emptied or set ablaze, and wells were choked with debris. Every mile gained was a mile further from the last reliable supply line. The soldiers marched through a landscape that offered no sustenance, no shelter, and no enemy to strike. Napoleon pushed the pace, convinced that a decisive engagement was just over the next ridge, but the ridge revealed only more smoke and more silence. The strategy was clear, yet impossible to counter. By burning their own crops and homes, the Russians were stripping the invaders of the very resources required to sustain such a massive force. Hunger became a silent, encroaching presence in the ranks. The deeper they marched into the void, the more the campaign began to resemble a pursuit of ghosts. The army was not being defeated by a sword, it was being hollowed out by the earth itself. At Borodino, the pursuit of ghosts finally ended. The Russian line held firm, and the French artillery opened the gates of hell. For one single afternoon, the earth became a furnace. Cannons hammered the infantry until the ground was slick with blood and churned soil. 70,000 men fell in the span of a few hours. The air grew thick with sulfur and the screams of the wounded, yet the front line barely shifted. Napoleon directed the slaughter from a ridge, watching his reserves dissolve into the smoke. He threw his best divisions into the center, hoping to shatter the resistance, but the Russian ranks absorbed the impact and refused to break. By nightfall, the field was a graveyard of broken equipment. Napoleon claimed the ground, but the cost was absolute. The Russian army did not collapse. It withdrew in disciplined silence, carrying its cohesion back into the darkness. He had won the space, but he had lost the war of attrition. He stood amidst the wreckage, looking out over the thousands of bodies, and realized the enemy was still intact. The victory was a hollow shell. The path to the capital lay open, but the spirit of the resistance remained entirely unbroken. Napoleon rode into Moscow expecting the keys to the city. He found only silence. The streets were deserted, the palaces locked, and the markets stripped bare. He established his headquarters in the Kremlin, waiting for the Tsar to send a messenger of defeat. The messenger never came. Instead, the first flames appeared on the horizon. By nightfall, the city was a sea of fire. Wooden structures ignited like tinder, and the wind whipped the inferno through every district. Napoleon watched from the ramparts as his prize melted into ash. The heat became unbearable, forcing him to retreat to a nearby chateau. He remained there for 35 days, staring at the blackened skyline, waiting for a peace offer that existed only in his mind. The food ran out. The horses began to die. The army sat in the ruins of the capital, idle and exposed, while the temperature began to drop. Every day of waiting was a day of rotting strength. The realization finally took root. He had merely occupied its funeral pyre. In October, the order to retreat echoed through the camp. The army turned back, but the road was already gone. The first snow fell, light at first, then thickening into a blinding wall of white. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The cold did not just bite, it paralyzed. Soldiers stopped to rest and simply never stood up again. Their limbs stiffened. The horses died in their harnesses, their breath frosting into ice on their muzzles. Men cut the animals open, desperate for warmth. Cannons were abandoned, left to sink into the deep drifts as the draft animals collapsed one by one. The Grande Armée lost its cohesion, then its speed, and finally its humanity. Every mile was a gauntlet of ice and exhaustion. The path behind them was littered with discarded muskets and the bodies of the fallen half buried in the shifting snow. They were no longer an army. They were a procession of ghosts walking toward a horizon that offered no sanctuary. The survivors crossed the border, but they brought back more than just their lives. They brought the news of a broken myth. The invincible force that had dictated the terms of European peace for a decade had been dismantled by the frost and the fire of the East. In the halls of Berlin, Vienna, and Stockholm, the silence was replaced by the sound of sharpening steel. Prussia, which had long bowed under the weight of French occupation, was the first to act. They broke their treaties and began to mobilize their reserves. Austria, sensing the shift in the wind, abandoned its forced neutrality. Sweden joined the growing chorus of defiance. The wounded lion of France was limping, and the predators were closing in. Diplomatic channels went dark. Napoleon, back in Paris, found his maps changing color by the hour. The coalition was no longer a collection of scattered states. Every report from the frontier confirmed the same truth. The fear that had kept Europe in check had evaporated. The convergence happened at Leipzig in October 1813. The coalition brought three massive armies together, surrounding the French positions from every cardinal point. For 3 days, the ground shook under the weight of constant artillery fire. Napoleon moved his men to plug the gaps, but the sheer volume of the opposition overwhelmed his remaining reserves. The defensive perimeter began to crack. Bridges were blown. Supply wagons were abandoned, and the cohesion of the French force shattered in the mud. By the time the smoke cleared, the coalition had secured the field. The myth of the invincible commander had been dismantled piece by piece. Napoleon retreated toward Paris, but the momentum of the coalition was unstoppable. The political foundations of his rule dissolved as quickly as his armies. Faced with the total collapse of his power and the occupation of his capital, he signed the instrument of abdication. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe was stripped of his authority. He was stripped of his titles and forced to depart for the island of Elba. The Mediterranean became his prison, a small, rocky outpost where he was left to watch the waves. Elba was a speck of rock in the Mediterranean, a place where time was supposed to stand still. Napoleon walked the perimeter of the island every morning, his boots crunching against the dry, uneven shale. He was granted a small guard and the title of sovereign, but the island was a cage. He spent his days reorganizing the local mines and inspecting the coastal defenses, yet his mind never left the continent. Every ship that docked in the harbor was met with a barrage of questions. He demanded newspapers, letters, and rumors from Paris. The coalition had grown complacent, assuming the lion was toothless. They left him with a small fleet and a loose watch. Napoleon paced the northern cliffs, staring across the water toward the French coast. He saw the cracks in the new order. The island was quiet, but his thoughts were loud. He watched the horizon until the blue of the sea blurred into the gray of the French shore. The escape happened under a moonless sky. A small brig slipped out of the harbor, carrying the man who had been told he was finished. Days later, he stepped onto the beach at Gulf Juan. There was no army to greet him, only the cold sand and the gamble of a lifetime. He moved north, toward the mountains, toward Paris. The government in the capital panicked, sending regiments to intercept the intruder. At Laffrey, the two forces finally met on a narrow road. Napoleon walked forward, alone, into the space between the lines. He stopped. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, waiting. The royalist commander gave the order to fire, but the silence stretched, heavy and absolute. Then, the soldiers broke ranks. They surged forward, not with rifles raised, but with shouts of recognition. The line of defense dissolved into a mass of men cheering for the return of their leader. Napoleon did not stop to celebrate. He climbed back onto his horse and pushed forward. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a man reclaimed by his own legend. The throne was waiting, and the final act of his life was about to begin. The fields of Waterloo were a sodden expanse of churned earth and smoke. Napoleon stood on a rise, his eyes fixed on the ridge, where the Duke of Wellington had anchored his defense. The air hummed with the constant vibration of cannon fire. Napoleon signaled the advance, and waves of men surged upward, their boots slipping in the mud, their progress slowed by the relentless barrage. From the high ground, the assault was brutal, a grinding collision of force against stubborn resolve. Hours passed, and the ground grew slick with the cost of the struggle. Napoleon committed his reserves, pushing to break the center, but the line held. Then, the horizon to the east darkened with the movement of new columns. The Prussians had arrived. The sound of their arrival rippled through the French ranks, like a physical blow. The pressure shifted instantly. Wellington sensed the moment and ordered the counter-advance. The French line began to buckle. Napoleon watched as his final gamble collapsed, the weight of the entire campaign pressing down on the ridge. The momentum had swung. The order to retreat never came, because there was no one left to give it. The French army, once a disciplined machine, disintegrated into a frantic tide of men fleeing the field. Cannons were left mired in the mud, their teams dead or scattered. Muskets lay discarded in the tall grass, abandoned by soldiers who no longer cared for the weight of them. Napoleon stood amidst the wreckage, watching his final hope dissolve into the smoke. He tried to rally the remnants of his guard, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the pursuing coalition. The panic was absolute. He turned his horse away from the ridge, moving through the chaos of men who no longer recognized their leader. There was no path back to Paris. There was no path to safety. He reached the coast, hoping for an escape that would never materialize. The net closed in. He was intercepted, his sword taken, his movements halted by the very powers he had once defied. The man who had redrawn the map of the world stood silent as the reality of his situation took hold. The era of his dominance was over. The empire he had built with such singular focus had vanished, leaving him a prisoner of the peace he had spent his life trying to destroy. The world he had once commanded shrank to the size of a volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic. St. Helena was a jagged, wind-swept prison, thousands of miles from the capitals he had once occupied. The transition was absolute. The noise of marching armies and the weight of statecraft were replaced by the relentless, rhythmic crashing of waves. Napoleon spent his days in a small, damp house, but he rarely stayed inside. He walked. He paced the narrow paths. He looked out over the expanse of the ocean, searching for a sail, a messenger, or any sign that the world still remembered his name. There was only the horizon. The vast, empty blue stretched in every direction, indifferent to the man who had once redrawn the map of Europe. His movements were monitored, his letters checked, his influence severed from the continent he had shaped. Time slowed to the pace of the tides, and the silence of the island became the only thing he could not conquer. The strength that had once driven armies across continents finally abandoned him. In the spring of 1821, the pacing stopped. He spent his final weeks confined to a narrow bed, his breathing shallow, his hands unable to grip the maps he had once mastered. The man who had commanded the fate of millions could no longer command his own pulse. He lay in the damp, dark room, listening to the wind. The ambition that had fueled his rise, the hunger for power that had reshaped the borders of the world, was silenced by the simple, brutal reality of biology. Even a god of war must eat to survive, and in the end, he was just a man, hollowed out by time and isolation. He died in May, far from the battlefields. The ocean continued its rhythmic assault against the cliffs, indifferent to the life that had just flickered out. The era of the Emperor ended with a final, quiet breath.